So we called this session Inside the Mind of a Voice Hacker, the Evolution of Enterprise Voice Threats. A lot of us think about enterprise voice security. We think about things like toll fraud, things that have come out of previous generations. But we've, as we get into a mobile world, a world where voice is going over lots of different kinds of networks, there are lots of different kinds of threats that we may be exposing our enterprises to through our voice systems. And we've got a couple of experts here who are just kind of in the front lines of this and have some great experiences to share with us. And I'm going to bring them out now. First of all, a gentleman who we're calling our voice hacker. Weston Hecker is network security engineer and hacker at High Point Networks. Thanks, Weston. Thanks for being here. And Mark Collier is CTO of SecureLogix. That's you. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
Well, Weston, we really appreciate your being here. This is, as I say, this is an audience that I think realizes that there's more security issues they have to deal with all the time, and to hear it from somebody who has your kind of experiences is really going to be helpful to them.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
So I guess to start out, maybe if I could ask you to just talk a little about yourself, or about sort of you've kind of characterized yourself as a hacker. What does that mean to you, and what should it mean to them?
Well, basically, what got me into hacking was originally early on, when I was about 14 years old. I started teaching myself programming and just having a curiosity to figure out how things work. And that's something where I started teaching myself assembly and C++, and eventually I got into reverse engineering. There was actual malware that came out in the early 90s that reversed the BIOS on your computer, which physically bricked the computer. And it was something that I was just wondering how that worked. So it was something where I actually got into reverse engineering, pulled it apart, saw how it worked. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's...
And this was what kind of a system were you working on, or what kind of computer?
Oh, that was an IBM Aptiva, if I remember correctly, and that was pretty... before that I had an actual DOS computer, but I didn't have internet connectivity. It was pretty rare. I lived born and raised in North Dakota, so... It's something where we didn't get steady internet until the mid-90s. So, yeah.
And so now, so you kind of have been doing this kind of work and doing this kind of exploration. Mm-hmm. Obviously, this is a conference that focuses on communications, and we talk about a voice hacker. Were you ever like a student of the sort of phone freaks, or the kind of people who kind of were the early hackers?
Oh yeah, that was definitely something. I got into a lot of the IRC chat rooms. I was trained by some of the better voice hackers out there, a lot of the better reverse engineers. There was some going on where people were let go of companies in the 90s, and some of the best programmers out there were actually some of the best reverse engineers. So I got to be taught by some of the best, and some of the early freaking. Yeah, that was a very good scene to be in, and I just miss some of those days. It's nice to look back at some of that. I wasn't in the early 70s and 80s stuff, but it's definitely still, to catch the tail end of it was really, really nice. So, and that's something, yeah.
So what kind of things are you working on now that's relevant to kind of the voice and communications world? I know that you've been kind of studying some of the things that have come out of Eastern Europe, and can you describe maybe what those exploits are, or what's first of all kind of what's going on, and then how our audience should think about is this really a threat to me, or how do I prepare to defend against it?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I did a talk at DEF CON 23 that was a couple of years ago. That I did a telephone denial of service with a prepaid cell phone, basically pulled the firmware off of it, rewrote the operating system, and then I made it make 70 calls a minute, which got me the attention of the Department of Homeland Security and the University of Houston. So that was something where now we're actually getting paid to attack in an environment some of the PSAPs and 911 centers and make mitigation strategies. And I made some connections back at DEF CON 18 that they've helped me immensely by giving me early access to a lot of the software service platforms that the bad guys are actually using. So some of them were the early versions of CryptoLocker. The newest version I got this year. And then there's an actual telephone denial of service platform that they're going to start using for ransoming and stuff like that. So, and it's something where I don't speak fluent Russian, so I had to, first step was getting it translated over, and then the next stage of it is just tearing it apart, seeing how it works, and then getting it to the manufacturers after I've done enough poking with it to know that it's something that they can securely use, writing manuals so they can actually operate it themselves, and they can stress test their own voice environments, or they can actually build it in to their security where they can actually have footprints and fingerprints for this kind of stuff so they can block them.
So, and just to, a lot of us may have either a casual or a more formal understanding of some of these things, but like ransomware is...
It's basically if you've heard of somebody where they had to pay a certain amount of bitcoins or use prepaid credit cards, ransomware is something where it'll actually go into your computer and it'll actually start encrypting the file system. And that's something where, people are forced to pay because, especially in the Midwest, people don't have proper backups. And it's something where, they're forced to pay ransoms that double if they're not paid in a certain amount of time frame. So it's actually locking up their entire file system, and then it's something where people, it just stops them from legitimately using their computer and impacting the businesses. There becomes X, which is the factor of paying the ransom, and then the lost downtime, which can be $60,000 to $70,000 in some instances, so they don't even hesitate to pay the $1,600 in bitcoins. So,
And you've kind of worked with companies that have been targets of this kind of ransomware, and
oh yeah, that's something that I've dug pretty deeply into. I found a couple ways to stop the newest version of CryptoLocker just by making your real machines look like virtual machines, and some more obscure ways of actually blocking the malware from fully infecting your computer. So,
And is that something companies? I guess what's the level of awareness that you see of these types of threats within companies? Do most companies have, of any a medium or larger size company have a kind of a CSO and a security staff that they've got a kind of a checklist of the threats that they consider to be the most serious, and this is one of them? Or is this kind of an area where there's new activity and people are getting surprised by things?
Yeah, it comes in waves. People are briefed on, and every disaster recovery policy made within the last 3 or 4 years has how to attack these kind of situations. And some of the older versions, they were very easy to catch because it was pulling files, encrypting them into memory, and now they have ways of getting around and actually killing the watchdogs of the antivirus and some of the other stuff. So as it's progressing, it's a better mousetrap type situation, and it's something that definitely people are briefed on it. Having proper backups is something that has gotten invaluable over the years, and it's something that a lot of the companies are integrating. So, and I'm glad to see it too, because that's the last thing they want to do is after these ransoms are paid, they are used for committing other crimes, and some of those are of a more serious nature. So,
Mark, what in terms of the levels of the threats and the dynamism of the situation, what are you seeing at SecureLogix?
Well, the first thing I would say to follow on the last question is, CISOs, the security people, they've got a list of threats that are this big, and they've got people and budget for something like this. So the kind of things we're talking about right now, unfortunately, 99% of the time are in the purview of the people here. The security people don't want to deal with another threat for the voice systems, the UC systems. They want the UC managers and so on, everybody here to deal with it. From a threat point of view, the attack surface is growing. For 3 days, we've been hearing about all this new software, all these new messaging systems and whatever. So with more software, more stuff in the cloud, more movement over untrusted networks, mobile, you're going to have more threats. But at the end of the day, in my opinion, every single day in the 30 minutes that we're up here, you'll also be receiving a lot of malicious calls. You're going to have robocalls. You might have bomb threats. That's an issue going around the country right now. Weston talked about telephony denial of service. You've got social engineering. So there's a lot of issues out there, but a lot of times I go back to a lot of it's about malicious calls, because every minute we're receiving nuisance or harassing or threatening calls. So that's kind of what we focus on addressing.
Is when you think about a malicious call like a bomb threat, it seems like it would be hard to have kind of a systematic response or protection against that. Is there some sort of a gatekeeper or something you can do against that? Or
well, right now, and to add on to what Weston talked about ransomware, there's an organization called the Evacuation Squad. They're this Russian organization, and what they're doing right now is they're flooding schools across the country with bomb threats.
Really?
And be happy to show you some articles and whatever. But the reason they're doing it is they're basically showing off how disruptive and effective this service is. And then rumor is in March they're going to start charging for it. So, you know, you can give them $5, they'll call a school. You can give them $20, they'll call a major sporting event. $50, maybe they call you, and you have to empty this room out. So it's they're showing off the service, they're giving it away for free, and then in March, if you have Bitcoin, you can call in a bomb threat. And they're very difficult to detect because they spoof the number. We were blocking them, and then they changed the source number to the local police department. So it's a tricky problem. So, but it's about extortion.
And what's under the covers of, is the work that they're doing to accomplish that result, is that a particularly difficult thing from a hacking perspective to do, or is this some young, you know, fairly inexperienced or relatively unsophisticated, you know, computing users?
That's the thing of it. It's becoming easier and easier to use, and that's why they're using a software as a service, which, you know, was the keywords, buzzwords from several years ago. And it's something that now actually, you know, to offer technical support on an attack tool for a network, that's something that I never thought I'd see the day where that would happen. So, and that's what I'm saying. It's getting easier and easier to use. People don't have to be voice over IP experts or even hackers. They can literally just pay to have these services using for denial of service. And the easier it gets to use, and the easier that they have for that, that's when it starts to get really scary. So.
And these guys have a freemium model. They give it away, and then they're going to start charging for it.
Ad supported even eventually, I'm sure.
So, and we have in our audience always quite a few, you know, the kind of users you described, school districts, universities. So if you and I don't know how many of you may have already heard about this if you're in the audience or be aware of it. If you haven't been aware of it, what's kind of your first? How do you think about responding? You know, gathering, first of all, I guess gathering the information about it, finding credible information, and then coming up with an appropriate response.
Yeah. Well, first thing I've been doing is looking at some of the tools and just figuring out how they work. And some of the methods, some of them are very, very old school methods where they'll use, there are some botnets that have been developed they're in their third revision of them for cell phones. And once those cell phones are in the networks, there's some simple ones that use VLAN hopping methods and some other methods that attack internal infrastructure. And it's just scary to see that they're, you know, going to that depth and that level. And, you know, not only using, you know, if there's 50,000 compromised phones, they can now lease them through those software as a service platforms. And you can literally rent 10,000 phones and hold down, you know, XXX environments. And that's kind of the things where and some of the actual real-time communication stuff with cross web browser attacks. And it's as new technologies come, people come up with new ways and, you know, to hold down other infrastructures. So,
Mark? Have you guys at SecureLogix, you know, I know you have relationships and obviously, you know, do business with law enforcement and government agencies. What's your sense about these kind of? It seems like the kind of attacks we're talking about, they sort of combine technology and social engineering. Yeah. Is law enforcement? How focused are they on this versus maybe the other security threats that may be out there?
I would say they're aware of it, they're focused, but they're so busy. Yeah. You know, there's so many issues and criminals and organized crime and so on. So I think they're overwhelmed. And this area I think is new, so it's creating a challenge for them. I think it's difficult for them to respond because it's pretty new. I would not count on them solving your problem. You know.
And is if you're is there what's your approach if law enforcement is just overwhelmed? Is there any preventative measure, or is there any way when you get a bomb threat? Right. Is there any way at all that you can have either a tool or a way of detecting that this is or isn't legitimate?
Well, you know, our approach, you know, we're a security vendor, so we have a platform that we put into an enterprise or into a cloud environment or in the future a service provider environment, And to use a few buzzwords, it's an agile platform. It's got a business rules management system. So our approach over the last several years has been, whether it's TDoS, harassing calls, bomb threats, social engineering, account takeover in a contact center, the bad guys, and not that Weston is a bad guy, but you have to have something that's agile that can respond, because 3 months ago, this bomb threat issue wasn't even happening. It wasn't on anybody's radar. Now it's popped up. We've already seen the bad guy, get around some countermeasures, so you have to be able to respond quickly. So I think, again, to use a few buzzwords, you have to have a platform that's agile. The customer can't wait a year for you to put in a fix, because the tool has gotten more sophisticated. You need something that you can detect these attacks as they get smarter and respond to them.
Weston, what are some of the challenges maybe unique to or originating out of kind of the mobile voice world, or the mobile platforms that an enterprise may need to think about as they try to, one of the things that we talk about here is, we'd like to really kind of embrace the mobile, our mobile workers, and kind of bring them onto the platform that we use for all of our communications, but that just seems like you're inviting a whole new kind of vector of threat into your enterprise.
Yeah, as long as the thought's put into it of how it's actually going to be rolled out and the best practices are followed. Like, that's one of the biggest things that I'm seeing on pen tests and vulnerability assessments now, is that people aren't even following the best practices, and they're using older methodologies, and they get integrated by the third year they've owned it, and their licensing's run out, or there's other issues. So if you're going to do something, you need to have something that is agile and that is, that is able to be modified depending on what you see for your infrastructure. So, yeah.
Is when you mention one of the things that we talk about platform as a service, I guess as a delivery vehicle for attacks, is we talk a lot here about cloud services, and we always, whenever we do surveys or anybody does surveys about the cloud, the biggest concern that enterprises express is security. In addition to sort of attacks that may directly target enterprises, are you seeing attacks targeting the cloud providers, as a way of kind of sort of force multiplier of who you damage?
Yeah, it's definitely something that, there's more eggs in that basket. It's the kind of the Fort Knox of information. If you can, crack into one of those, you literally just hacked 106 or 1,100 companies at once. So that is something that is targeted, but also you're dealing with very, very brilliant people that protect those systems, but they still are susceptible to some of the vulnerabilities in the 0 days and some of those, unknown vulnerabilities that are out there. So yes, it's definitely something where everything is moving to the cloud, and from a cost perspective, it does make sense. And if you don't, it's very, very hard to come across security personnel at this time, even especially in the Midwest. That's something where there's a great shortage of it, and just in general across the United States, you can look at some of the statistics of some of the growth fields, and IP security is one of them. So it's going to be a shortage of people. That's why it's nice to be able to have cloud environments in some instances where they're actually maintaining proper levels of security when it's less of a focus internally. So.
I want to remind everybody that we're taking questions over Twitter, and they'll put those up on the screen here. So if you want to tweet questions, is a great opportunity to, if you have a particular challenge that you're interested in exploring. Mark, in terms of, again, the organizations within the enterprise, do you find that kind of the threats that have sort of been perennial threats in the communications world, the TDoS or the toll fraud, has there been any sort of additional awareness or additional, incorporating that into a security organization, or is that just something that's, again, relative to maybe the other, data loss or things that may seem much more serious, at least on the surface?
Well, to kind of add on something I said earlier, the awareness level is growing in the security groups and the collaboration groups. But again, from what I've seen, generally, most of these issues they're the responsibility of the people here. And I'll say again, the last thing the CISO wants to hear about is another threat that he has to worry about, that he doesn't have people for and doesn't have budget for, he or she. So it's like, that's your system for right now. you deal with it. You know, if you have a TDoS attack or robocall or whatever, bomb threat, that's generally the responsibility of the collaboration team right now. That's starting to change. You know, we're starting to see like a larger collaboration teams having a security expert within their group. I think that's the most common model, but it's still their responsibility. You know, and you know, everybody's different, but I would say that's the most common organizational thing.
And so what's the best way to kind of get smart or get educated on security if you're somebody who's mainly just trying to keep a voice system up and running and
Right.
you know, all the other other stuff?
Well, there's some pretty good resources out there. You know, you can follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn. Anytime that I find an article or a resource that is useful, I put it on there. Not that, you know, I'm the end-all be-all, but that's a decent starting point to you know, find informational resources, kind of have a pulse of what's going on. You know, feel free to come by our booth later. You know, we really just touched on the surface of the issues here in this brief session, so you know, come by and talk to us in Weston. You know, you know, we'll be here all day, so you know, take advantage of it.
So Weston, what kind of, as you sort of think ahead, what do you think are going to be kind of the next cutting edge issues for kind of voice and real-time security? What do you see on the horizon?
I just see the speed at which they're pushing out some of this. They're going to start cutting corners to meet their deadlines and stuff, and that will be probably one of the bigger security flaws in some of the voice rollouts and some of the more emerging technologies as it's more changing to, you know, instead of the big systems, it'll be moving to something that's more mobile and more modular. So, yeah, that would be the biggest thing is some of the speed at which they're rolled out. They'll start automating some of the, you know, the checking of the actual security or this code reviewing, and they'll start. Yeah, that's something that will take a little bit more out of the process. So
There'll just be more holes in the software to exploit.
exactly.
That's right.
Yeah.
One of the things we've talked about a lot here is like the increasing use of APIs in communications, and people want to be able to kind of create these services on the fly. Does that kind of an environment lend itself to easier exploitation?
Some of the current paths that people are looking at. I can't mention any vendors, but yeah, that's one of the things. Some of the quick rollout tools, like they're actually ways to do cross browser attacks and stuff like that. And right now, there are processes in place, and I hope they do keep those in place for actually reviewing some of the more simple vulnerabilities and things like that. And that's something that, yeah, not only to keep their name safe, but to actually keep the customer safe and keep it as a viable method of rolling out some of that stuff. It does take away from a little bit of the speed of it, but it's something where, yeah, keeping safety in mind and security in mind is what it's my first thought in the process. So,
Is that, Mark, from your perspective as a vendor in the space, is that a kind of business opportunity for you if you get this kind of API-based environment?
Certainly, possibly. You know, anytime you provide this rich API, you know, you're exposing is a strong word, but you know, you're letting, you know, partners and app developers and so on away into your system. So, I mean, it increases the threat surface. I think there's a big need for better software assurance. I mean, people. There's a lot of code being written. You know, all us vendors are very competitive. We want to get our features out, and you know, there's generally a need for writing better software. But that's a tough problem, a very tough problem.
Okay.
You know.
Well, we've got some questions here that I'd love to get on. You guys see one that you like? I'm kind of interested in the third one. Is there a way for the enterprise to prevent or mitigate someone from spoofing company published phone numbers? Is it just, you know, your phone numbers are out there, that people can do that kind of automated thing?
That is a very difficult problem, and you know, it's kind of the root of all evil for a lot of these attacks. You know, we all get these annoying robocalls, for example, on our landlines, if we still have them, our cell phones, whatever. And you know, now the bad guys are starting to spoof to your number or whatever to get around these blacklists. It's a really tough problem. I don't have a bulletproof solution for it right now. I will say that we're working closely with a group at the Department of Homeland Security. They've given us a significant amount of funding to address that specific problem. So I like to say I'm going to make a dent in that problem, but it's difficult. We need to work with the service providers to get us more data, because if all we have is a number and it may or may not be spoofed, it's a tough problem. So, but we're trying to tackle that. Okay. Hopefully I'll come back next year and say I've made a dent in that and I can detect it 60% of the time or something, but it's a challenge.
Yeah.
Is that, Weston, in the kind of attacks or the bomb threat kind of scenario, is that kind of like a two-edged? It seems like not only can you make the bomb threat, but you can spoof it to a phone number that can damage the person whose number you're spoofing.
Yeah, that's something where they can get a lot of flack from it, or they can get a lot of calls back. That was one of the original attack methods that I had for telephone denial of service, was calling somebody with a spoofed caller ID information, and now they're going to get random calls from all those people that they called at 4 in the morning, allegedly. Mm-hmm. And there's like methods like that where people use those kind of methods. But as far as they've been locking down on some of the SIP and PRI services with the actual ability to spoof on the provider level, which is nice to see, but it's still something that is still rampant, and they know which vendors are allowing those kind of services, and then there's other devices and methods to get around those. But it's nice to see some of the research that he's doing with as far as locking down some of those methods, because that's one of the bigger problems in the voice over IP community. So,
are the service providers, both mobile service providers and phone companies, is their security, pretty solid, or do they have particular issues that they're dealing with?
I think it varies. I think every service provider is kind of at a different phase in the evolution of how much security they have. I mean, we work very closely with the larger service providers. In a lot of cases, when enterprises have issues that we've described, they'll go to AT&T or Verizon or whoever, and oftentimes they'll turn around and offer us up as a solution. So, but I think the right way to solve a lot of these issues is to get technology like ours, if I may say that, into the service provider environment where, Enterprise Connect is having a bomb threat issue. You don't have time to put a box somewhere. You need to fix it right now. So getting the right technology in the right place in the service provider network and so on allows you to do that much quicker. And I think that'll happen. It's just that it takes time. Mm-hmm.
One of the things, we have a program on WebRTC that we run on Monday, and it seems like inherently, if you're starting to throw all kinds of multimedia and whatever kind of voice traffic over the web, going to people's web browsers, and kind of the WebRTC explanation is it's encrypted end to end.
Right.
Is that an adequate explanation, or is there more to it?
Yeah, there are some. Adding encryption to it is a really good starting point, but some of the ways in the past that people are using classic methods and routines to actually strip some of the encryption or get in between those, and that's kind of what I'm seeing used in there. And then I'm seeing some of the improper usage of those protocols for tracking and some of the other stuff. So I think it's something that I'll be interested to see which direction it goes. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm seeing out in the wild. But so
to me, it just seems like another way, another convenient, anonymous way of generating malicious calls. That's yeah, they're encrypted. You can't eavesdrop on them, but it's just another way to generate bad calls. Is the way I look at it.
So is that fair to say that or is it complacent to say eavesdropping, or this idea that we used to have that you could sniff packets and capture them and eavesdrop, that encryption may kind of help that, and so the threats in voice nowadays aren't so much about eavesdropping, but about these kind of malicious behaviors and social engineering related things?
That's my opinion, although I'll say it really depends on what you're talking about. I mean, to give one example, if you could eavesdrop on all the conversations in like a big financial contact center, and you could snag all the DTMF for people's PINs and things like that, that would be an incredibly lucrative place to eavesdrop. Now, is it worth eavesdropping on my call to Weston or whatever? I don't know. I think it really depends on, how critical your conversation is. I mean, if you're in South America or whatever, where the environment is very, very threatening, maybe so. But, your typical call, encryption's more of a pain,
Right.
you know. But it certainly has its place,
Okay.
my opinion.
I would agree with that.
All right, well, we're just about out of time. We appreciate your questions. I really appreciate Weston, you being here, and Mark, you joining us. It's certainly a topic everybody's concerned about security, and rightfully so. And so it's something I'm sure we're going to be revisiting, and there's always going to be new stuff to talk about. So thanks very much to you guys. I really appreciate it.
And
Thank
thanks
you,
for
Eric.
attending.